West Forum on Politics and Policy. Our goal at the West Forum is to help students and community better understand the government and politics in South Carolina, and we're grateful to the West family for their support in this effort. For students who are here today, we guess that some of you are seeking cultural event credit for this event, and I just want to remind you that if you are doing that, you need to remain in attendance for the entire event. You need to join on time, which obviously all of you have. You need to enable your webcam for the duration of the event and remain in camera view. And please don't be doing anything dangerous in that time, like driving. And also the Cultural Event Committee asks that you not open a new web browser, you stay in our event, and we encourage you to ask questions during the discussion portion of the event. We're going to do questions in the chat, which is at the bottom of your screen. And we ask that you put any questions you have in there, and we're going to try to get to all of them by the time that the event is finished. So I'll be introducing our three speakers now. I want to tell you that two of our speakers are together in the same place in Bancroft Hall. And so that's exciting that they're on campus and in the same place. And then our other speaker is also with us from Winthrop University. So our first speaker for today is Dr. Eddie Lee. He's a professor in the history department, and he's the director of graduate studies in history. Dr. Lee earned his PhD at the University of South Carolina in history. He earned a master's here at Winthrop, and he earned a bachelor's degree in history and political science at Presbyterian College. His interests include 20th century America, South Carolina history, public history, and teacher education. Our second speaker today will be Dr. John Holder. Dr. John Holder is an instructor in the political science department. He earned his PhD in public policy at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte in 2013. And I just want to add that he paid for it through his winnings with the Wheel of Fortune, which he was on. He'll probably tell you what year, but he did pay for his PhD that way, which I think is really cool. He earned his master's degree in political science at the George Washington University and his bachelor's in political science at Haverford College. And Dr. Holder is interested in American government, state and local government, the executive, Congress, the judiciary, public opinion, political parties, and many other topics related to political science, but his expertise is also in elections. Our third speaker for today is Ms. Amanda McLeod. Ms. McLeod works as the government documents reference librarian at our university library. She earned her master's in information science at University of Texas in Austin, and she's also a proud Winthrop alum and earned her undergraduate degree in psychology at Winthrop. Ms. McLeod is interested in connecting the Winthrop community and just the broader York County community with government information and the free resources that are available to everyone through the library. So we're happy to have her here today as well. So we're going to go ahead and get started with Dr. Lee. And once again, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll get to them as we progress through everyone's presentations. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to see you today. I'm going to take you back about 90 years if I can, and we're going to talk about the original 100 days of 1933. I entitled my comments this morning, The 100-Day Hurricane of 1933. And of course, I'm speaking about Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal's early years. 20 years ago in 2001, NBC television anchor Tom Brokaw published his bestseller, The Greatest Generation. It is a magnificent, inspiring study of the men and the women who came of age in the Great Depression during hard times. These people survived a whirlwind as the economy crashed around them during the Great Depression. Throughout the 1920s, America had been on a roller coaster ride, which I think is the right image, with easy credit, an unregulated stock market, the overproduction of durable goods like refrigerators, farms experiencing droughts and infestation of boll weevils. The boll weevil came to South Carolina, by the way, in 1920. We got a head start on the Great Depression here in the state of South Carolina. What the boll weevil did was it shredded the cotton crop across the South. And banks that had been irresponsible with the accounts of depositors, the vaults were empty. The 1920s were loose years, and they were followed by a hangover. And then in 1932, about 90 years ago, the roller coaster went off the tracks. Angry and desperate veterans of World War I, 17,000 of them, with 28,000 more desperate family members close behind, marched on the United States Capitol. They wanted their bonus that was called. It was a pension that they had been promised. After the Great War, World War I, Congress had promised these World War I veterans that they would get a bonus, a pension in 1945. Well, they didn't need it in 1945. They needed it right then in 1932. So they marched on the U.S. Capitol, which sounds kind of eerily familiar. And they occupied the Capitol for a while. In the summer of 1932, they were hungry and they were homeless and they were hot and they were desperate. And the members of Congress were frightened by these bonus marchers and they fled the building. But the greatest generation, that's that title again of that Tom Brokaw book, the greatest generation stepped forward that November and they changed the direction of the United States. Democratic Party nominee Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt of New York promised the nation a New Deal. What a wonderful slogan, a New Deal. In my home county, Roosevelt received 8,000 votes, and incumbent Herbert Hoover received 8 votes. It's a landslide, 8,000 to 8. My father, who, like my mother, was a member of the Greatest Generation, was at the county courthouse on election night as the ballot boxes came in that November of 1932. And what would happen is they'd bring the ballot boxes in those days. There were no voting machines, and they would empty them there on the table and they'd begin the counting. And my father told me time and time again that what happened was they went through the ballots and the teller would say, Roosevelt, 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 Roosevelt. And occasionally the teller would say, Hoover. And the whole courtroom would just burst into laughter. It was a landslide. 22,809,638 popular votes for FDR to 15,758,900 popular votes for Herbert Hoover. 472 electoral votes to 59. From November 1932 to March the 4th of 1933, which was the inauguration then, they were inaugurated in March and not January, Roosevelt toured the country. In Miami, 1 month before the inauguration, this would be February 1933, during a visit in a motorcade in a parade, a man named Giuseppe Zangara, who said that his stomach talked to him and his stomach told him to shoot Franklin Roosevelt. Giuseppe Zangara stood on a park bench and unloaded his revolver at the incoming president. Shot after shot after shot, and everyone missed Franklin D. Roosevelt. But it mortally wounded the governor of Chicago, who happened to be visiting in Miami. It was almost like God was protecting Franklin Roosevelt from Giuseppe Zangara's bullets in his talking stomach. While he was dodging assassins, Franklin Roosevelt assembled the Brain Trust. And this is something I would like for our students to remember. Experts. Brain Trust, which was actually called the Brains Trust originally. Experts on banks, the stock market, employment, agriculture, industry. So on March the 4th, 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt was sworn in on the Capitol steps, and he told the members of the Greatest Generation, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. One of the Brain Trusts wrote that. That's a classic line, as Dr. Holder would agree probably. The Brain Trust was ready. during our most recent presidential campaign, we heard it said, make a plan. Well, the Brain Trust had a plan. They were ready because they'd been working on this. And actually what they had done is they had worked in the state of New York on it. While Franklin Roosevelt was governor in the state of New York, they experimented and they tinkered with what's going to be the New Deal and what's going to be the 100 days. So they had a plan and they were ready. The 100 days, as historians know those days, commenced immediately. I was telling someone earlier this morning that the emergency banking bill was nothing but a newspaper that was rolled up because there was only one copy of it. And so they didn't even have a time to duplicate it. They voted for it in Congress because they knew that it was indeed an emergency. So those are the 100 days. They start in March of 1933 and they go until June the 9th of 1933. And they will always be the yardstick. And Dr. Holder will tell you in a few minutes about the later 100-day periods of other presidents, but the original 100 days is the Franklin Roosevelt hurricane of 1933. It was a hurricane of activity. Congress voting on bills that were not even typed yet, just sheets of paper rolled to look like bills, details to come later. Everyone understood the urgency. The 100 days. March to June 1933, they were bipartisan. But let me explain that a little bit, because they were bipartisan because the Democratic Party tsunami, which had swept FDR into Washington, remember the margin in my home county, 8,000 to 8, it had swept out to sea most Republicans. And now in early 1933, the remaining Republicans who had almost experienced their own political death and were outnumbered in both houses of Congress 2-1, they endorsed the New Deal, the 100-day legislation coming from Roosevelt and his Brain Trust, because they had a plan. The Brain Trust had been practicing in the state of New York while Roosevelt served as its governor. Here they are, a couple of them. Names that we don't really remember much anymore. But these were the people of the 100 days. Attorney Raymond Moley, who helped write that first inaugural address, which is the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Ray Moley. That was delivered on March the 4th, 1933. Economist Rex Tugwell from Columbia University. Adolph Burrell, a lawyer, an expert on corporations. Louis Brandeis, Supreme Court Justice, who was an informal member of the Brain Trust, but a supporter of the New Deal. Harold Ickes was a Republican. He was a liberal Republican, but he was a convert, and he would be Secretary of the Interior. He was a member of the Brain Trust. Frances Perkins, a female. Frances Perkins, the first female cabinet member, Secretary of Labor for the entire 12 years of the Roosevelt presidency. And then there was the social worker, Harry Hopkins, who was perhaps the closest of the group to FDR. Harry Hopkins, during the World War II period, went on very sensitive diplomatic missions. He wore many hats, but during the 100 days, he was the social worker who came in to say, we need to help people. We need to help people. Immediately, the action commenced because these people were ready to implement their plan to recharge the dead battery of America, which in March 1933 was just about dead, with 23% unemployment, empty bank vaults, problems in agriculture like the boll weevil that I started my comments with, a collapsed stock market where people had invested and they had paper fortunes and not real fortunes. And my parents, those members of the greatest generation, they were from farm families. They were from farm families. And for several years, hungry, desperate individuals would appear at the back door of their houses. And what would happen is they would ride the rails and they would hop off the train with their families, and they would come to my grandmother's house and knock on the back door because they were hungry. And my mother used to say that, they would give them food and water. And then when they were ready to move on, they would hop back on a train that passed. These were hard times. There was a real need for the 100 days. And these were the forgotten Americans that the 100 days of 1933 were designed to help. And so the hurricane of 1933, the 100 Days Hurricane, was a time of creativity, and it began for the next 100 days. And there were all kinds of pieces of legislation. And just to touch upon a couple of them that I think are interesting, the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, farmers were paid not to produce. And you heard that correctly. Farmers were paid not to produce. And it would jack up prices, and it saved America's agriculture system, I think. The Economy Act. One of the first pieces of legislation was the Economy Act. I love telling my students about it. Members of Congress made $12,500 a year in 1933. The Economy Act said, you need to reduce your salary. Members of Congress voted to reduce their own salary. You might want to jot that down. That never happens in 2021. They reduced their salary from $12,500 a year to $10,000 a year. The Civilian Conservation Corps of the 100 Days. Young unemployed boys were paid to plant trees and fight forest fires and build roadways and build parks. They were paid $1 a day by the Civilian Conservation Corps, and they were paid $1 a day. And at the end of the month, they didn't get $30, they got $5. The rest of their pay went to their unemployed parents back home. What a wonderful concept for government to do it that way. And the way the families looked at it was, this is not a handout. This is money that Johnny earned fighting forest fires, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And just one more, the Tennessee Valley Authority, one of the success stories of the New Deal, one of the success stories of the 100-day hurricane. This American hurricane for 100 days, from March to June 1933, it's the 100 days, which other presidents have tried to emulate. And Dr. Holden's going to tell you about that in a minute. But sometimes you have that gold standard of FDR. And when you talk about JFK, or you talk about Richard Nixon, or you talk about Ronald Reagan, or you talk about the Bushes, I'm not sure, but we'll hear that in just a minute. That's why in 2021, we paused this morning, because it's the end of the 100 days of the Biden administration. We paused this morning, and we remember the original 100 days with the common purposes of 1933 and the desperation and the hunger, but the hope and the excitement of the Roosevelt time, a time of true bipartisanship and optimism of a man and his talented brain trust, made up of men and women who had a plan, and they transformed and they saved America, and they restored our nation's confidence and our spirit, because this was the time for the greatest generation. I want to thank you all for being so attentive. I'm going to step out of my chair, and Dr. Holder is going to take it, and I'm going to be over here. So when we end up, if we have questions or comments, I'm in the room. Thank you, Senator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee.
Yeah.
We had some technical issues, but luckily we took care of them pretty easily. So Dr. Holder is our next speaker, and he's got some PowerPoints for you, which we're about to put up on the screen as well.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I do apologize for the technical problem. So Dr. Lee covered 100 days, and I'm going to cover 100 days for every administration since then, briefly. Next slide, please. So here you see a quote, just emphasizing the fact that every president since Roosevelt has been compared to Roosevelt. We've had 14 presidents since Roosevelt's death. And the first 100 days of every administration has been compared to the first 100 days of FDR because he set the standard. So what I'm going to do is just briefly describe the first 100 days of each presidency since then and talk about what each president accomplished, what the challenges they faced, and just kind of conclude with some comparative thoughts. So next slide, please. So Richard Neustadt, who was a distinguished scholar of the presidency, if you've taken a class with me, you've heard of Richard Neustadt, argued about 20 years ago that it's unfair to compare every president since Roosevelt to Roosevelt in terms of the first 100 days. Neustadt really didn't think that the first 100 days of the Roosevelt administration was a fair benchmark for everybody else because FDR faced an unprecedented national emergency and he had overwhelming support, as Dr. Lee pointed out, so that he could get things done. Neustadt pointed out that in 1933, the 20th Amendment changed the date, not only for the presidential inauguration, but for the time Congress convened. Until 1933, which includes the beginning of FDR's term, Congress didn't meet until later in the year. So Roosevelt comes in March with this national emergency going on. Congress isn't there, and he can govern basically by executive order. And it's a lot easier to make policy just with a stroke of the pen rather than having to send it through Congress to be approved. So Roosevelt ended up issuing far more executive orders than any other president in history. Over 12 years, he issued over 3,000. People were getting a little concerned when Biden did 20-something in his first week. But that's just by comparison. Next slide, please. Neustadt also argues that most new presidents of the contemporary era have less executive experience than Roosevelt did, having been governor of what was then the nation's largest state, New York. And particularly with Republican presidents, one or more houses of Congress may be controlled by the opposition party. The Democrats controlled the House of Representatives without interruption from 1955 to 1995. So every Republican president, Nixon, Ford, the first President Bush, came in with the Democratic House. Reagan, Democratic House, and a Republican Senate. So Republican presidents pretty much automatically faced a certain level of political opposition. George W. Bush comes in, Biden comes in. Bush came in with a Republican House, Biden's coming in with a Democratic House, but in both cases, there's a 50-50 Senate. And the only reason the president's party controls the Senate is with the vice presidential tiebreaker. And of course, if you follow the news, you've heard about the filibusters. So it's very difficult to get anything done in the Senate with 51 votes. Next slide, please. So let's start with Truman. Truman, of course, took office upon Roosevelt's death. So the big things facing him were the end of World War II. The first thing he did was pledge to continue the war effort. World War II ended in Europe during Truman's first 100 days. It didn't end in the Pacific until later that summer. But Truman had to make the decision to use the atomic bomb against Japan. He didn't know about it until he became president. Truman was only vice president for 82 days before Roosevelt's death. And basically, he was called to the White House. He was told that the president had died. He was sworn in. And within a couple of days, the advisors came to him and said, Mr. President, you should know that we have a weapon that can destroy the earth. And he had to decide whether to use that against Japan in order to expedite the end of the war, which is, of course, a much more monumental decision than the average domestic policy crisis. And also in Truman's first 100 days was the organizing conference for the United Nations, which had been planned to begin with while Roosevelt was still alive. So that's a pretty monumental 100 days, but there wasn't much domestic policy action in the way we think of Roosevelt's first 100 days as involving revolutionary domestic policy. Next slide, please. So Eisenhower comes in 1953, and Eisenhower, having been a military leader, was not all that concerned with domestic policy. Now, it's significant that he comes in as the first Republican president in 20 years. Roosevelt was elected 4 times, Truman was elected once, and there was still a great deal of bipartisan support for the legacy of the New Deal. So Eisenhower didn't set out to try to reverse all of that. He was more interested in he was more interested in foreign policy and military policy rather than revolutionary domestic policy. And he had to deal with a lot of foreign policy. Stalin died less than 100 years after Eisenhower took office, which sets up a transition of power in the Soviet Union. And that was his thing. Next slide, please. Kennedy comes in with the new frontier, made a big deal out of the fact that he was the first president born in the 20th century. He was one of the youngest, he was the youngest person ever elected president, not the youngest to serve as president. But he comes in with this very sort of new approach, very idealistic approach. And within the first 100 days, he establishes the Peace Corps. He establishes the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity, which was very revolutionary in an era of racial segregation. The Bay of Pigs effort, the military operation to overthrow the government of Cuba, which was a spectacular failure, was launched during Kennedy's first 100 days, and he started to increase U.S. military commitment in Vietnam. Next slide, please. So Johnson, of course, comes in after President Kennedy's assassination. And one of the first things he does, what became the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had been sort of languishing in Congress. Johnson enthusiastically supported it. And shortly after Kennedy's assassination, in Johnson's first speech to Congress as president, he says we should enact this civil rights bill as a memorial to President Kennedy. We should continue President Kennedy's policies and President Kennedy's goals. And he also got a major education bill passed not long after he took office. Johnson, of course, was elected to a full term in 1964, and Johnson saw himself as a protege of Franklin Roosevelt. He had gotten elected to Congress during the Roosevelt administration. He tried to emulate Roosevelt, so he wanted his own big deal first 100 days when he was elected to a full term in 1965, or took office for his full term in 1965. So we had kind of a second first 100 days for LBJ. Next slide, please. This is going to take just a couple of seconds to cover. Richard Nixon wasn't that interested in domestic policy, and he thought 100 days was just this artificial, arbitrary deadline. They got a lot of stuff done, but he didn't particularly care about it being portrayed as the first 100 days of Richard Nixon. Next slide, please. So Gerald Ford comes in 1974 after Richard Nixon has resigned rather than been impeached. The memorable line from Ford's inaugural address is, "My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over." So Ford's challenge as he takes office following the first president who resigned is national unity, national healing after Watergate. He wants to bring people together, get past Watergate. But the first thing he did less than a month after taking office was pardon Nixon, which meant Nixon could not be prosecuted for any crimes that it might have turned out that he committed during the Watergate scandal. Ford was concerned with inflation and economic stagnation. So that was his major domestic initiative. And within his first 100 days, he also came up with a reform of federal housing policy. Next slide, please. Jimmy Carter, the major domestic challenge facing the United States in 1977 was energy independence. So that was the first thing Carter focused on. But Carter, having been a small state governor, found that it was much more difficult than he had anticipated to translate his experiences as governor of Georgia to the presidency of the United States. He had pretty good relations with the Georgia legislature, but that didn't prepare him to deal with Congress. So he came in with this very ambitious agenda, and Speaker Tip O'Neill said, well, Mr. President, we need to set some priorities. What do you want to deal with first? And Carter said something like, we want to do all of it. So he sort of shoved all this stuff onto Congress, and they didn't accomplish much simply because Carter had not led in the sense of establishing any kind of priorities. Carter also pardoned the people who had evaded the draft during Vietnam and gone to Canada or other countries so that they could accept the pardon and come back to the US. Next slide, please. Ronald Reagan comes in 1981. This is the end of the Iranian hostage crisis. Iran released the hostages as Reagan was taking the oath of office, literally. So the 52 Americans who'd been held captive in Tehran for 444 days since November 4th, 1979, were set free and sent back to the United States. Reagan's big domestic policy initiative, Reagan ran for the presidency saying, we can cut taxes, cut domestic spending, increase defense spending, and balance the budget. So he presents this very ambitious plan to Congress, but he's got to get it through a Democratic House. And the House wasn't particularly enthusiastic about it, even though there were a lot of conservative Southern Democrats in the House in those days who might have been amenable to cutting taxes. But the real big event of Reagan's early presidency was that he was the victim of an assassination attempt. And it is now clear that he was much more gravely injured than the White House let on at the time. He almost died, but the surgery was successful. They took him to George Washington University Hospital. They fixed him up, and not long after the shooting, he came back, addressed Congress in the sort of very triumphant return, called for Congress to pass his tax cut plan, and it happened. Reagan was called the great communicator because he was really good at persuading people to do things. Next slide, please. So George H.W. Bush comes in, having been Reagan's vice president, is elected to his own term, and the best thing Bush could do was simply try to continue Reagan's policies. So there wasn't a major new, let's do a whole bunch of new stuff in the first 100 days of this term. He focused more on foreign policy than domestic. Next slide, please. Bill Clinton comes in, and again, small state governor becoming president of the United States and discovering that Washington is a lot more complicated than, in this case, Little Rock. They tried to reform healthcare. Every Democratic president since Truman has talked about universal healthcare, and it still hasn't happened yet. So they tried to reform healthcare. Clinton did a lot of controversial things on social policy, like make it easier for LGBT people to serve in the military. It was called Don't Ask, Don't Tell, but there was a lot of opposition generated to that, and that detracted from what he was trying to do with his economic goals. And Clinton said, we need to raise taxes. We need to balance the budget by raising taxes. That was, as you can imagine, extremely controversial. It passed the House by one vote. It passed the Senate with the vice president's tiebreaker. Now, it did end up balancing the budget starting in 1997, and Clinton was handily reelected in 96, but his first 100 days were pretty rocky. Next slide, please. George W. Bush coming in as the governor of Texas. Bush's plans were tax cuts and education reform. And he also wanted energy independence. So that was what he worked on. He started traveling around the country promoting tax cuts, education reform, and got a lot done during his first year, but those were the things he focused on during the first 100 days. Next slide, please. So the Obama slide is a little longer. Obama comes in We're in the midst of the Great Recession, which was the worst economic climate since the Great Depression. Got a $700 billion recovery bill passed through Congress, ordered the military prison in Guantanamo Bay to eventually close, eventually being, one of those unclear adverbs, started to address climate change, signed the Lilly Ledbetter Equal Pay Act, named for a woman who had successfully sued because she had unsuccessfully sued because her employer was paying her less than men who did the same job. So Congress fixed that by making it a violation of federal law, increased healthcare access for kids, and the Obama administration is the first place we see social media starting to be an important part of White House communication. Yeah. Twitter, Facebook, and so forth, and these social media platforms that were just starting to develop at that time in the late 2000s. Next slide, please. So Trump, here's another slide with a lot of things listed on it. Trump was interested in trade policy. So he was very much opposed to the existing trade agreements, NAFTA, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, very much interested in energy independence as opposed to the Obama administration's focus on climate change. So Trump wants to increase oil production, assert ourselves militarily, beef up the border so that potential terrorists don't come into the country, although this locked out a lot of other people, increased the identification and deportation of people who were here illegally, called for increased federal funding of charter schools and school choice, unsuccessfully tried to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Republicans have been trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act ever since it was enacted, unsuccessfully. And because the Senate had not acted on the Supreme Court vacancy that occurred during President Obama's last year in office, Trump was able to fill a Supreme Court seat almost immediately. Next slide, please. So here we have present tense Joe Biden, 24 executive orders during his first week of office, many of which were reversing things that the Trump administration had done. He canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, has now made it possible for transgender people to serve in the military. We have a $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill enacted, including another round of stimulus checks, expedited distribution of vaccines, has returned to a plan to combat climate change. We are now debating a $2.3 trillion infrastructure package, and he has announced plans to pull U.S. troops out of Afghanistan by this September 11th, which is the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. And so the big challenge that Biden's been dealing with is how to fix COVID and how to address the economic impact of COVID, a national economic shutdown and the unemployment that's resulted and so forth. And of course, as you've seen in the news, we have a surge in the number of people trying to get into the United States from Mexico. And that's the thing that most people have identified the administration as not dealing with satisfactorily. That's where Biden has the highest disapproval rating, is his handling of the border crisis. One more slide, please. So to briefly summarize 88 years of presidential history, Democratic presidents usually come in with ambitious domestic policy agendas, just as FDR did. And healthcare has been a big part of that for Bill Clinton, for Barack Obama. Biden's having to deal with healthcare explicitly in terms of the COVID crisis. He's coming in with a lot of very controversial Trump policies that he wants to get rid of immediately. And Biden was not the first choice of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. So all those folks who voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary last year are begging Biden to, or pushing Biden to move even faster, even further. Republican presidents have generally been focused on some combination of foreign policy and tax cuts, because Republican presidents generally don't have really aggressive domestic policy agendas in terms of using the government to address healthcare, using the government to address some other issue. So that's what you hear about in the first 100 days of most Republican administrations. And if you are Harry Truman, whose predecessor, President Roosevelt, has just died, Lyndon Johnson, whose predecessor, John F. Kennedy, has just been assassinated, Gerald Ford, whose predecessor, Richard Nixon, has just resigned, the first thing you've got to do is reassure the country that things are okay and we're going to get back on track, even given this national trauma. And you've also got to keep policy going, as well as establishing your own policy priorities for the rest of the term. So that's a real quick summary of presidential history since 1945. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holder.
You're very
And
welcome.
our third presenter today is Ms. Amanda McLeod.
All right. So I'm going to be approaching the first 100 days of a presidency through the lens of U.S. government documents. So I'm going to be spotlighting some documents that are relevant, mostly focusing on the last couple of administrations, so not quite as far back. I do have a link to a LibGuide page that I will share in the chat that has links to the full text of some of the documents that I'm going to show, because I have snippets, as well as some older documents from administrations like FDR and JFK that I don't have time to share with y'all, okay? So let's go ahead and get this pulled up. Okay. Are y'all seeing the PowerPoint? Awesome. Okay, so again, I am looking at the first 100 days of a presidency through government documents, and I'm focusing on two primary collections. And that's going to be the public papers of the president, so how they're actually talking about their progress in their administration in their public remarks and interviews that they've done. And then I'm going to look at some records from congressional records. So that's going to be how members of Congress are actually talking about the presidency. So you'll see some of the same connections that Dr. Holder was talking about as well, in terms of the priorities that get laid out based on a president's political affiliation. So again, I'm starting with the presidential documents collection. I'm working in reverse chronological order, so I'm going to start with the Biden administration, and I'm sharing mostly just like one document for each administration, just in the interest of time. So this is a transcript of a speech that President Biden made was on March 18th. And one of his main goals, or one of the goals that he set forth early on in terms of dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, was that he wanted to see nationally 100 million vaccine doses administered within the first 100 days of his presidency. And so in these remarks, he's talking about reaching that benchmark well before the end of the first 100 days. And so that's something that, again, I don't have all of the documents in this PowerPoint, but that's something that has appeared multiple times in his remarks since this time in March of this year, because we've met that goal and we've exceeded it. And so he's emphasizing that as sort of a win and something that they have accomplished as a very concrete goal. And you also see at the very bottom in this last paragraph, the putting checks in pockets. That's referring to the American Rescue Plan, the big stimulus package that was also a big policy goal. Okay, and so I'm jumping straight into the President's Weekly Address, and this is from President Trump's administration. This was made on April 28th. You'll see that date pop up when you're looking at the first 100 days for presidential administrations, because that is the 100th day. So a lot of times if a president is addressing their progress, they might happen around that same time. So in this address, President Trump is talking about the things that he views as his main successes in his first 100 days. So he's talking about action being taken on moving a tax cut through. And you'll see that again, as Dr. Holder said, Republican presidents tend to have that as a priority focus for the early days of their administration. He also talks a lot about creating an environment that is pro-business and supporting American businesses and workers. Now, I included this speech. This is from President Obama, just because I think it's kind of fun. not all of the speeches that presidents make are always very serious and policy focused. This is from the White House Correspondents' Dinner. If you're not familiar with that, a lot of times the president will attend, and it's sort of a usually in their speech they're kind of poking fun at themselves and other people who work in the political sphere. So you can see that in this speech. They're poking fun at the Fox News table and at Dick Cheney and other folks in the administration, or who've previously been working in politics. But even in this speech, which is kind of tongue-in-cheek and a little bit lighter, he's still talking about what they've accomplished, which is, they've pushed through that big economic recovery package, and they're forging a new path in Iraq, and gotten a budget through. So there's even sort of in this lighter focused speech, is still emphasizing the things that they have managed to successfully do and accomplish in those first 100 days. And then this is a radio address from President Bush. And again, you can see it was April 28th in 2001. So right at the end of the first 100-day benchmark. And again, you start to see some of those themes emerge in terms of, this is another Republican president. And one of the things that he's talking about is tax relief as an important principle. And they're moving forward with that in Congress. And I also thought it was interesting. This is from 2001, and he's talking about wanting to sort of get rid of some of the bitterness and divisiveness in politics. And, I'll let you judge for yourself how much we've moved forward in that area. But I thought that was also interesting. Okay. So I'm also going to kind of move on at this point and talk about congressional documents. So just as kind of a little bit of information about this, these are going to be coming from the Congressional Record. And the Congressional Record is like the daily business of both houses of Congress, so both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And so I'm focusing specifically on sort of speeches that are made in either the House or the Senate floor by various members of Congress. And so for each administration that I'm including, I'm looking at the Trump administration, looking at Obama and Bush. So again, just focusing on the last few administrations. I have one speech from a Republican and one from a Democrat, just because it's sort of interesting to contrast to see how partisan leaning impacts your interpretation and what they're saying about what a president has accomplished. So this speech, again, this is just a snippet, and it is from the Senate. And so we have Senator Schumer talking about President Trump's first 100 days, and he's essentially saying that the president hasn't met the promises and isn't fulfilling the promises that he's made. He is criticizing the policy and movement on healthcare, and that they hasn't moved forward on the infrastructure bill. That was also something that President Trump had talked about. So it really is a very critical speech. And you compare that to this speech this is from the House, from a Republican, where he is talking about what he views as the president's successes. So again, talking about sort of that pro-business approach and creating an environment where American workers and the middle class have an advocate in the Oval Office in a way that they didn't see that they had before. And it's sort of interesting. They the Morning Again in America is, I believe, a callback to Ronald Reagan. So again, sort of building on that sort of legacy. And one thing that comes up sometimes in some of these documents, and I didn't share this in the PowerPoint, but there's a Bill Clinton interview where that kind of hits on this theme as well. Anytime there's like a concern that maybe that first 100 days isn't going according to plan, or maybe that it's not moving forward in the way that the administration might like, they'll often start talking about, we weren't elected for 100 days, and it's a benchmark, but we're still doing the work. So you can see that a little bit in this speech as well. Like there's still time to move forward. And then we have President Obama, and this is a speech from let me make sure, I believe this is Senate, and it's from this is again a very critical speech of President Obama, and it's criticizing especially the spending and the fact that, what is seen as an accomplishment for President Obama, he talks about that the stimulus package, that economic relief bill. Senator Kyle Hiller is talking about how he sees it as just unmitigated spending. You're not concerned about the national debt, and ultimately you're creating a debt for the future that you're not going to be able to pay for, which tends to be a criticism that you'll see often with Democratic administrations. And then you compare that to this speech from Senator Durbin, where it's like, we have done this massive economic recovery package, and that is a good thing. You know, we are helping to provide relief to Americans who need it. And they talk about extending healthcare, health insurance to uninsured children from working families, which was a major accomplishment, moving forward with the equal pay. So again, sort of highlighting those main areas that are seen as sort of the success points for President Obama's first 100 days. Okay, and then this one I thought was particularly interesting. This is from President Bush, and this is from the House. And so this first document is from a Democrat who is really criticizing President Bush's environmental policy in the first 100 days. And it's part of a much longer speech with several representatives who speak. But I'm just highlighting this initial part where he's really just very critical and really calling him out for not acting on climate change and not moving forward and really understanding the pressing issues. And then you see really, and you don't, I didn't see exactly this kind of response. This was somebody who hadn't planned to speak, as he says at the very beginning, but this is a Republican who's responding to this speech and really saying, basically saying that he doesn't agree at all with the representations that were made by his colleagues, and arguing that President Bush is moving forward with things that a previous Democratic president hadn't acted on in terms of vehicle fuel economy and environmental standards, and really saying that we need to see the whole picture. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And so you can see especially with these two speeches together, how partisanship can sometimes really impact how you view the same action. So you can look at that lens. Okay. So that is all that I had for the documents that I wanted to share. Let me add, like I said, I have a link here. I'm going to drop it into the chat that has links to all of the full text of those documents, as well as some additional ones that might also be of interest. I was going to do a quick demo of GovInfo, which is where I'm pulling most of these from. That's the online digital repository for government information. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to drop a link to GovInfo in the chat as well. If anybody has any questions about that, you can reach out to me.
Ms. McLeod, this was so informative and interesting. I was reading all the speeches as fast as I could on the screen as you were putting them. So I appreciate you doing that for us. And if I was a student on this call who needed to write a paper about anything to do with the presidency or Congress, I would be taking some notes and writing down your name and saying, I'm going to email Ms. McLeod to ask her about how I can get access to different things. So I'm glad you're putting the link in there. I think it's really important. We had a question in the chat that I want to go ahead and address to you first. It says, since Winthrop has been a government documents repository since the 1890s, are there documents relating to presidential administrations back to the 1890s in the Dacus Library, or are most of them of recent administrations? I think it would be helpful for students to know that.
So it kind of depends. We do have like the public papers of the president series, which is where I pulled a lot of those documents from. I think from the 40s on. I'm not sure how much early documents that we have. I don't know that we go all the way back to the 90s. We have sort of census records and other sort of agency records that go back that long, but not as much with the presidential records.
Okay, thank you for that. We had so many really great questions in the chat. If the speakers are interested, they can go in there and look at them. I want to highlight two themes that really came out of the chat. So I'm combining your questions, and I hope you don't mind that I'm doing that, but I know we don't have time for all of them. So I'm combining by two different themes. And the first theme, I think, is really both for Dr. Lee and Dr. Holder. And the questions really relate to comparing sort of bipartisan effectiveness or not bipartisan effectiveness. So people are wondering about the different 100 days periods where one party is in charge in the presidency and another party is in charge in the House and Senate, and asking about the effectiveness of what a president can do in that first 100 days when that is the case. One person specifically asked about the Senate filibuster and how that may have impacted the first 100 days for people. He wanted to know whether it was good or bad. So you can give us your opinions on that if you like. But the general question, I think, is like, what happens when bipartisanship is not an option like it was for President Roosevelt?
Yeah, excellent question. We've been scrolling through the questions in the chat, and we are both really impressed. It's a lot harder to get anything done now because things are so much more partisan. It's not only that the membership is more closely divided, it's that compared to 40 years ago, all of the Democrats in Congress are more liberal and all of the Republicans in Congress are more conservative. There's virtually nobody left in the middle. So if you hear about people like Senator Manchin of West Virginia, Senator Sinema of Arizona, who are the two most conservative Democrats in the Senate, they're still to the left of all of the Republicans. And particularly because of the filibuster, because the minority party in the Senate, as long as they have at least 41 votes, they can block just about everything. Ideally, that would bring about compromise. The flip side of compromise is gridlock, where nothing gets done at all. And I think we see a lot more of that than we did, well, particularly with Roosevelt, as Dr. Lee told you, the Congress was overwhelmingly Democratic. So it was a lot easier for him to get stuff done. Is the filibuster good or bad? Yes. I'm teaching a class on the Congress. I see Lynn Horton in the audience. We're about to have a debate on abolishing the filibuster, and that's what we're going to do for the rest of the semester. It depends. The filibuster can prevent good things from happening, and the filibuster can prevent bad things from happening. So yeah, it's kind of amoral. It depends on how it's used.
And I want to just say that we have been looking at these questions, and they're excellent questions. And I know it's about noon, but let me just add to what Dr. Holder told you, that the center does not hold now. And that's a line from a poem, but the center does not hold. There is no center. And so we've become fractured politically, and that makes it a lot more difficult for a president to be able to reach some kind of consensus with the people in the other party. The master at pushing things through was Lyndon Johnson. He was in the Johnson treatment. I don't know that style would work in 2021. I certainly don't think President Biden is of that style. FDR had his own style, and when he was dealing with the press, and the press would ask him some question at a news conference he didn't want to answer, he would just say, "Boys, there's no answer to that today, and there's no news on that today." And he would just say, "I'm not going to tell you." And that just worked. And the press would go off and say, "Okay, well, we won't ask him again." That'll never happen in 2021. They demand answers. Just watch any of the press briefings. Please let me turn it back over to Katerina. And we've got Dr. Holder here, and I'm here, and we've got Amanda here, and we're ready to do whatever you need for the next few minutes.
I want to ask one other question, and it actually relates to that, Dr. Lee. It has to do with optics. A lot of people asked questions that have to do with optics. Some of them concern specifically the role of the media in the first 100 days of these presidencies. So, for example, fireside chats and now social media. But also someone asked about how Roosevelt's polio might have impacted his first 100 days with those appearances.
Oh, those are great. Those are great things. Franklin Roosevelt held 1,000 news conferences course, he was in office for 12 years, and he was a master in communicating with the American people. That first fireside chat, which was during the 100 days, when he said, I want to talk, he and Ms. Roosevelt, he said, I would like to talk with the American people about banks. In the background, you can probably hear Ms. Roosevelt putting away our dinner dishes. Well, she wasn't putting away the dinner dishes, but you heard something clanging in the background and you felt like the Roosevelts were just like you. And he commented about banks. And he said, we're going to inspect the banks and we're going to reopen the banks and Congress is going to take action. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. Let me say this about disability. And I'm glad you asked me that. He was paralyzed in 1921. He had just run as vice president in 1920. And, so he was paralyzed from 1921 until he died in 1945. I don't think, and Richard Nixon even said this, he didn't even know he was paralyzed. He said a lot of Americans that were adults and fairly intelligent people didn't know that Franklin Roosevelt was paralyzed. It was almost a secret. It would never be a secret now. It would never be a secret now. When a president falls down 3 times on the steps of Air Force One, and believe me, I've fallen down the steps of Kynard and I've fallen down the steps of Bancroft, but I'm not president of the United States. When a president falls down the steps of Air Force One, they take the picture and they rerun it and they rerun it and they rerun it. Not in the Roosevelt time. And I will just add this. He died at age 63, which I think of as very young, but dealing with the Great Depression and dealing with the demons of the 20th century and World War II. Look at those pictures of Franklin Roosevelt as we get closer to 1945. He's just depleted. But you're not going to find people like writing editorials about that. And you're not going to find people saying, this is a man that's going to die. The press was different then than it is today.
So I'm going to slide back into the frame and talk about contemporary media. The media these days, it's more intrusive. It's 24/7, and there's a lot more of it. When Ronald Reagan took office 40 years ago, there were 3 TV networks plus PBS and CNN. Now you have, thousands of cable channels and news with every conceivable ideological perspective and social media. Basically, everybody who has an iPhone and a Twitter account can be their own source of news. And not all of it's honest and not all of it's well informed. And we talked about Roosevelt. People didn't know that Roosevelt was paralyzed. The first time I was aware of how much more intrusive the media was, just in terms of being there and putting stuff out and putting information out. Ronald Reagan had surgery for prostate cancer. And there was an illustration of the prostate gland on the front page of the New York Times. And that just shows you how much things have changed. And that was 1985. And it's gotten even worse with the internet. So the media makes it, you can get a lot more information faster now just by picking up your phone than you could when you had to wait for the 6 o'clock news of the next day's newspaper. But there's a lot more inaccuracy, there's a lot more polarization, and I think the media makes it a lot harder to get anything done.
Thank you for that. There was definitely some fascination by Johnson. Several questions came in about President Johnson, including a person wondering about the laws that he helped create related to civil rights and whether they happened in the first 100 days. Another person, sort of a themed question, was ghosts of presidents past. So every president was doing things considering the ghosts of presidents before him. And people were wondering about Johnson's emulation of Roosevelt, his contempt of JFK. Do either of you care to talk about Johnson?
Well, I would just say this about Johnson. Johnson said that LBJ was like a daddy to him, Of course, if you read about LBJ, he would always say that certain people were like a daddy to him. He was close to Franklin Roosevelt when Roosevelt was president, and Lyndon Johnson was a young U.S. House member. And I think that Roosevelt felt lonely a lot because Eleanor Roosevelt was out and she was traveling and she was bringing back information. And so he would get in touch with this young House member, and Lyndon Johnson would go over there and they'd talk about very serious things and, you know, the leadership of the country. And there's a young House member and a president sitting there doing that. I think that Lyndon Johnson wanted to be like FDR. And certainly he launched his Great Society, which kind of has echoes of the New Deal. And his War on Poverty had echoes of the New Deal with Project Head Start and the Office of Economic Opportunity and all the things of the War on Poverty. But you know what? And this is important for us to remember as we kind of like head into the afternoon, and because we're talking about removing the troops. And I listened to President Biden's comments yesterday about removing the troops. You know, it was the second war that did Lyndon Johnson. It wasn't the war on poverty. It was the second war that did him in. It was the war in Vietnam. That's why Lyndon Johnson will never have his image sketched on or etched on Mount Rushmore. You know, the Vietnam War, he was a casualty of the Vietnam War. And it destroyed him. President Biden had, I guess, 5 or 6 historians meet with him there at the White House back on March the 3rd. One of them was Doris Kearns Goodwin, and she's written eloquently about Franklin Roosevelt and also Abraham Lincoln and others. You know, I think that there's much to learn from the history that we've talked about this morning and what Dr. Holder did with the presidents after FDR. You know, they make errors. They're human beings and they make misjudgments, and sometimes they fail to communicate clearly. But you know, under our system, this is the way it works. And it's important for us to, you know, try to watch that and make it more efficient. And that's why it's so important for all of you to be sure you vote. And I would say just what I think you would agree, Dr. Holder, vote in every election.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Vote in every election. So that's what I would add. And don't let me kind of distract us, because Dr. Holder has something he wants to add about this.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to address the question about the Civil Rights Act. Johnson kind of set all of that up in his first 100 days, but the Civil Rights Act wasn't passed until 1964, summer 64. The Voting Rights Act was passed after Johnson had been reelected in the summer of 1965. So things took longer than 100 days, but he was using the 100 days for planning and setup and whatever. And again, you know, he's still dealing with the death of John F. Kennedy, and the country's still dealing with JFK's assassination. So that made it more difficult to get things done than would be typical of the first 100 days, January to April, after a normal election.
Thank you. I think that we are out of time, and I know students have 12:30 classes that they may need to actually get in their cars and drive to. So I don't want to keep you any longer. But I do want to thank our 3 speakers. I hope that all of you took down at least one person's name, and we'll be contacting them about something that they said today. I hope you take something away from this that you can use or talk to your parents about or talk to your colleagues or friends about. And I appreciate all of you being here. And also I appreciate our 3 speakers for doing this today.
We enjoyed it.
Thanks.
We enjoyed it.
Yes,
Thank you a
very
lot.
much.
Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. You too. Thanks, everybody.